Good afternoon, and good morning to our West Coast participants. Thank you for joining today's ICD webinar, COVID-19, What Canadian Directors Need to Know. My name is Rahul Bardwaj. I'm the President and CEO of the ICD, and I will be moderating today's webinar. This webinar will run for 1 hour, including a 10 to 15 minute Q&A segment at the end. The session is interactive. You're encouraged to type in questions and comments throughout the presentation using the question function on the panel at the bottom of your webinar screen. We'll endeavor to answer all of your questions either during the presentation in the Q&A segment or through a direct reply. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. This event will be recorded and made available for replay from the ICD website /webinars. The presentation slides will advance automatically. Now, if you need technical assistance, please refer to the announcement on the screen. The presentation slides are available for download now and will continue to be available after today's session. The full recording of today's webinar will be uploaded to the ICD website later today. So COVID-19 presents some significant and unique challenges to boards. And as you may be aware, today the World Health Organization declared it a pandemic. So this is where the culture and the values of an organization really matter. At a time of heightened public anxiety, a calming influence from the board will help build confidence and demonstrate leadership. If a board is typically focused on hindsight, oversight, and foresight, those principles hold very true at this time. As the board will address its traditional areas of focus, albeit in a crisis management mode, contingency planning, business continuity, health and safety, and trust of stakeholders will no doubt rise to the top. Leadership with compassion will be the order of the day. With this in mind, this is what we're trying to achieve today on our webinar. As this is an evolving situation, today will not be the last word on the topic. We want to put a director lens on the issue and have a conversation around some of the nuances. I encourage you to post your questions and we'll do our best to address them. The last part of this webinar, before the Q&A, will focus on 10 considerations for directors in leading through this COVID crisis. This is not intended to be exhaustive or definitive, but to provide some early guidance. Now, in front of you, you'll see our agenda. In a moment, I will be introducing our panelists, and a reminder to everyone, we will be doing some audience polling. In fact, we're going to go to our first audience polling question. How confident is your board that your organization can adjust its strategy to address the implications of COVID-19? In order to vote, please click on the voting button at the bottom of your screen. Please submit your answers. We'll reveal the results shortly. And of course, you can submit any questions you have at any time. Now I'm pleased to welcome our panelists today. We have Cornell Wright. Cornell is a leading corporate lawyer. He is the chair of Tory's corporate department and a member of the firm's executive committee. He's played a lead role acting for some of Canada's largest public and private companies on their most significant strategic matters, including advising Thomson Reuters, the Woodbridge Company, Weston Group, and Brookfield Group. Cornell regularly counsels boards of directors and board committees on corporate governance matters, crisis management, and shareholder engagement issues. He's also a fellow of the American College of Governance Council. Welcome, Cornell. And joining us today as well is Peter Block. Peter's a native Albertan and a partner at Longview's Toronto office. Throughout his career as a consultant, Peter has supported organizations during periods of major change, including M&A, proxy contests, divestitures, leadership change, and other major transformation initiatives. He also led communications for Maple Leaf Foods and spent 14 years with a leading national Canadian public relations agency, including 4 years heading their financial communications practice. He spent 3 years and consulting career in Calgary, working for a number of small and large cap companies in the oil sands and energy services industries. Welcome to you both. Now, I'm going to take up the results of the first polling question, and I'll see here on the confidence level of boards about their organization's ability to adjust to its strategy. We've got some optimism here. We have 80% are either very confident or somewhat confident, which puts it at an 80% confidence level, which is pretty good. We had, in fact, started to survey our members who are coming in slightly higher at 88%, so well in line with that. Maybe I'll go to you first, Cornell. 80% of the participants today are confident about their ability to adjust strategies. Does that surprise you?
No, I mean, I think it reflects the fact that companies, we're early stage in this issue. Companies have pre-existing plans, and I think the question will really be to continue to assess for each board its confidence as the situation unfolds to make sure they're confident that the company is doing what it ought to be doing in the circumstances.
Right. Peter, what do you think?
I think it's a very healthy sign. I hope what it also means is that a lot of these organizations have gone through some dress rehearsals and tried it out, their plans. I would agree with Cornell, they've got plans, but going to the test is always a good idea, and doing some dry runs annual is a good idea. So hopefully they've done that, and they're confident for those reasons.
Great. Let's move on into first question to you and get into the meat of this issue a little bit. Very curious to know, what are you advising your clients to help them make sense of this very evolving situation, and maybe even a little bit about what's different about this crisis? And Peter, maybe I'll go to you.
Sure. So as we just talked about, a lot of organizations should or probably do have plans, which is great. But there's a lot of difference in this than in any kind of crisis plan an organization faces. It's, first of all, not limited to you. It's going to affect all your geographies. If you're operating in more than one geography, it conceivably could affect all of your people. And so it's not just a plant or an operation or a branch of your business being affected. It could be the entire organization, regardless of the sector. So first and foremost, do you have, and this is what we're asking our clients, is your crisis communication or your crisis team capable of responding to this kind of vast situation and this kind of broad reach of the situation, as opposed to what a typical crisis may look like, if there's such a thing as a typical crisis.
Right. And Cornell, when you're speaking with some of your board clients, what have you been advising them?
Look, I think the key point that I see in this situation that makes it stand out is the fact that you've got a situation with a health and safety issue for employees across, Peter, you said all geographies, but also a situation where there's significant business consequences that flow from different things that can happen, but also from different responses you could take. And I think the board's key job, obviously, is not to manage the crisis per se, but to ensure that it's comfortable with how management is managing the crisis and with the choices and trade-offs that are being made in terms of looking after health and safety of employees relative to protecting the business in other ways, and be comfortable that the choices being made reflect the board's view of the company's values.
So let's move on to our next audience polling question. So we're getting warmed up here. Just a reminder to everybody that these responses are anonymous. The question you should have in front of you now is, how confident are you that your board is receiving sufficient information from both management and advisors to facilitate the board decision-making during the COVID-19 outbreak? And we'll wait for our answers to come in. As they do, I want to move over a little bit back to Cornell and Peter and back into the boardroom. As boards and directors are trying to navigate this space, and it's coming at them really fast, what should the role of the board be in the crisis response process? And maybe we can talk a little bit about some principles that could be guiding them and the level of engagement they should be thinking about. Peter, maybe I'll go to you first.
Sure. The level of engagement, I'll start there, it will very much depend on the organization, if you're a public company, if you're a crown agency, if you're a nonprofit, and the level of engagement will be dictated by that. Generally speaking, what we see the role of the director being in a crisis situation like this is to ask the probing questions that help set the priorities. And by that, it's taking a broader horizon view of what the risks are and making sure that the risks are being prioritized by management. And so it's not just looking at the immediate, and it's not just, look, this is unprecedented territory. We haven't been in a crisis like this before. So you're trying to probe management. You want to look for gaps, not to trip management up, but because nobody knows what's coming. So you want to be making sure that the gaps are addressed and that you're not letting things slip by.
Cornell?
I agree with that. I think this is not a normal situation, and the board has to be more than a passive recipient of reports from management, because ultimately there are difficult scenarios that could emerge, and the board will in effect own the company's response. And so I think it's incumbent on every board to make sure that it's comfortable, it has adequate information systems in place, and I don't think it'll be sufficient to kind of wait for the next regularly scheduled board meeting. I think you'll want to make sure that you've in effect arranged with management what the right cadence of reporting and what kinds of decisions the board wants to be aware of and informed about in advance, and what kinds of things are part of what, in a sense, within management's discretion in terms of all these, to the extent of responses that engage competing priorities.
Right. So, in our director's education program, we teach a number of frameworks on how boards could look at their interaction with management, their oversight, fiduciary duty, and we talk about hindsight, oversight, and foresight. And we also talk about NIFO, the famous nose in, fingers out. Would this be a situation where we'd still want to maintain that same framework, but at a deeper level of engagement with management?
I think so. I mean, I think the starting point is every director will have a keen interest in this issue and how the company is responding to it. And so I think you have to both make sure that management is communicating, but also that the full board is aware. And it might be that different companies will have different ways of doing this. I've seen companies, for example, establish a kind of crisis protocol where the CEO is having regular dialogue with the various committee chairs on a preset cadence. I've seen other circumstances where the board is saying, let's have a briefing, once a week. I think there's a trade-off, again, because you don't want to distract management and take up a lot of time with kind of preparing for board interaction. But at the same time, by organizing it, you're ensuring the board gets informed, and you're making sure that you're using management time effectively.
I would concur. And I think what stays the same is the responsibilities that directors have versus the responsibilities that management has. I don't think that changes, and I've seen that in M&As, I've seen that in other crises. What changes, though, as Cornell talked about too, is the cadence, the reporting structures that are in place, how often people are getting information, and the kinds of how often decisions need to be made, and the meeting frequency may occur. But in terms of responsibilities and roles, I don't think this is the time to start trying out new roles and introducing concepts of directors being in the trenches with management. I think it's a time that you really want to have that careful oversight role that boards want.
Right. So part of the takeaway for me is this is not a time to be passive. It's time to be active. Not too much deference, but be strongly and actively engaged with what's going on.
Active oversight.
Active oversight. That's great. If I go back to the second question in our poll today, how confident are you that your board is receiving sufficient information to facilitate this decision-making? The good news, once again, is we've got about 73% are either very confident or somewhat confident, about a quarter not so confident, and some not confident at all, but not that material a number. So what does that tell you? You've got about 3/4 of feeling pretty confident about the type of information they're getting. Is this a case of we don't know what we don't know, or we're trusting management?
Probably a combination. I think, as the situation unfolds and something, doesn't go according to plan or a significant issue emerges, I think you might see those numbers change. But it is, I think, a healthy sign that people feel generally confident that the information systems are working. And I think at this stage, management teams have been proactive in providing updates to boards.
So let's pick up on that theme on our next slide, which is what are some questions you'd advise boards to ask management teams at this particular time? And you've alluded to a couple of those. If you were to advise boards now to say, this is a very unique scenario, it crosses borders, it's global, what sort of questions should they be asking management at this time that could be different than in ordinary times?
I think one would be, what updates are you making management team to our risk map? In other words, what are the risks that you're seeing in this context that's different from the ones that we ordinarily see in our business? I think a related point would be, where are there gaps in our business continuity plan? Every company has one, but it may not contemplate a situation like this, and what are the gaps that you see, and how are you addressing them?
Right. And I would add to, if and when this escalates, and hopefully it's only an if, not a when, but if this escalates, what will we stop doing? Because we could be down 20% of our workforce. We could have fewer market where we're actually having our operations. So what are we going to do, not only differently, but what are we going to stop doing? How are we going to prioritize the risks today, but also looking ahead in terms of where this crisis could lead?
And would it be fair to say that it would be incumbent upon management to be drawing out what the financial consequences of these risks are? And this is the time for the board to really get into understanding what the trade-offs and the challenges would be?
Absolutely. And, just to pull out one example, recently, Diageo had its financial results in January, indicated that COVID-19 was going to be a material issue for the company, but did not have a sense of the complete financial impact at the time. 3 weeks after their results, they came out with an update, and they actually then started quantifying what that number was. So if you want to talk about kind of active disclosure and taking a much more active role, here's a global beverage manufacturer, and they were speaking about it only in the point of China at that point, where the market was closed, and the implications thereof. So you can actually be quite proactive in terms of getting messages to the market and speaking to certain stakeholders as this crisis unfolds.
So let's go over, we're going to pick up more of these questions at the very end when we talk about specific questions that directors want to focus on. But let's go to the third audience polling question, and that is, how confident is your board that your organization has a sufficient crisis management plan in place during the COVID-19 outbreak? And please go ahead and post your answers. And while you're doing that, we'll move into the next question. And this is along the lines a little bit around best practices on who's got this right before. And I put it to our panelists, are there examples of boards that have responded well during a significant external, for that matter, internal crisis? Is there somebody that comes to your mind? Peter, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I can wave the flag where I used to work at Maple Foods. I wasn't there at the time, but certainly in terms of how a company responded to a crisis, it wasn't an external one, in fairness, but how it responded to a crisis, I think it's fair to say was one of the best examples that we've seen in this country in terms of transparency, in terms of changing the procedures and putting your values to work and demonstrating those values, as you do it in your opening remarks, Robert. So that came to bear in what they did. In the situation that we see ourselves in today, Microsoft and Google and a few of the other large tech companies have already announced that any hourly employees that are quarantined or in self-isolation will continue to be paid. There's an example, again, it's at a smaller scale perhaps, but an example of companies already responding to the situation, thinking through the implications, thinking through how they want to be remembered for this kind of issue and this kind of crisis. None of these companies caused it, but they're going to be judged by how they respond to it. And I think what we're seeing are examples of how companies are starting to respond already.
Interesting. And Cornell, what do you think?
So I think what was interesting in what Peter described is all of the companies he listed are ones that basically made decisions that were long-term in their orientation. And I think one of the tricky parts for boards in this context is to make sure that the decisions that management's making, because it's principally management making these decisions day to day, that they're consistent with the board's view of the values and the long-term best interest of the company. Because there are lots of competing short-term, you've got bonus plans that have targets for the year. You've got other metrics that people will be sensitive to that create short-term pressures. And to the extent boards want long-term decisions to be made, you have to make sure that you're encouraging and incentivizing people to make decisions in the long-term best interest of the company. And I think that's that is the board who's uniquely positioned really to ensure that's done.
And are there any particular examples of companies that strike you that have done something like this?
Well, we were talking earlier about TD, how in the context of the financial crisis, they extended the period where people could make mortgage payments. And obviously there'd be a near-term impact from that, but their goal was obviously to make sure that they built loyalty of their customer base over the long term. So I think it's an example of a decision that had a short-term impact, but where the company took a long-term view. And I think, when you talk to boards, that's generally their orientation, but I think you can't lose sight of the fact that there are, all the time there are competing pressures. I know in our business, we've told our lawyers, do not travel, and people have said, well, there's a file, a client I can go meet with, and if I go, might get this file. And, our management team has said to our lawyers, we care more about our people than we do about that file at the moment. So we've made a choice. And there are choices that have to be made, and you could see those choices being made in different ways. And I think one of the responsibilities of the board is to make sure they're understanding the decision-making framework that's being applied.
I think it's fair to say that board meetings right now, the emergency board meetings going on, people are trying to get a handle on a framework on how to address these issues. And sometimes there can be a rush to decision-making or a rush to, planning before everybody's had an opportunity to step back. Do you think it would be worthwhile for a board to actually take time to discuss the principles that are going to decide their decision-making when you've got a significant event like this?
I think it goes, Will, to one of your opening comments about making sure the board has adequate information. The problem in a situation like this is that the board doesn't know what it doesn't know. So you have to actually, one opening item that makes everything more efficient is to sit down with management and talk about the kinds of decisions that they see being made and how they're planning to approach them, and sort of setting the stage so the board can then say, well, look, these are the three things that we care most about. These are the interests we think we ought to be prioritizing, and to sort of set some parameters that then, in a sense, can guide the organization. And as long as you're kind of in a scenario that's part of what you realistically envision, management's got confidence that that they're aligned with the board. But if there are issues that have to be worked through, people can work them through it before we go down that path.
Yeah, organizations have values and purpose, and you're putting them to the test here. It's not necessarily that you need to change them or that you need to even review them. It's putting them into action, and this is where it's going to come. It's exactly what you need to do, is just put those values into action, and hopefully that's what boards will make sure management is doing, living to the values that they've already established for themselves.
And I think, the fact is that things are evolving in real time.
Right.
And so I think, you want as a board, and it might be that it's increasing the frequency of, for example, often companies, the CEO and the chair has a weekly call. But it might be that those calls get increased with frequency so that the chair has a sense of the kinds of issues that management is worried about, can assess whether these are points that need to be elevated and discussed at the board more broadly.
Great. So before we get into the 10 questions, let's have a look at the results of our third polling question. And just before I get into this, remind folks, if there are questions that you want addressed, please put them into the Q&A session so we can have a chat at the end. The third question was, how confident is your board that your organization has a sufficient crisis management plan in place? Slightly less optimistic than the two earlier questions, with 65-35. So 65% either very or somewhat confident, and I think it's important to note that in fact 15% very confident, 50% somewhat confident, so that makes up to 65, and the balance not so confident. So perhaps not all that surprising, but what do you think, Peter?
It's uncharted waters, and so I think if it was a crisis, maybe a cyber breach, then the directors would probably be more confident that their organization has a plan and is ready to enact its plan. Something like this, as we've been talking about, we don't know what we don't know. We don't know how far this may go. We don't know what the implications overall will be. We've seen some pretty extreme examples in countries around the world, And if it becomes a situation like that, then it's going to be hard to say, oh yeah, I'm quite confident we have this all figured out when we haven't been there before. So I think it's fair that you don't want people being overconfident, and I think that's what I would take away from these numbers, that it's a healthy level of confidence with a degree of concern around, do we have enough information, do we know where this is going?
I think that's right. I mean, it's inherently uncertain, and you're building a plan for an emerging situation, and you're trying to deal with kind of realistic scenarios in a world where your ability to deal with them is affected depending on your resources and your workforce and everything else. So it is a complicated endeavor, and so the plan is being continually updated. And I think it is not surprising that people are a bit uncertain about the adequacy of the plan, because the crisis itself is undefined at this point in terms of its severity and significance.
So let's have a look now at the questions for boards to ask themselves. And this will hopefully bring together a lot of the conversation that we've had already, put it together in a little bit of focus point. There are really three, I would say, buckets of questions here. There are a couple of them around process, some about what do we know, and one which is really saying what do we need to know and the type of information that we'll need to enhance our decision making or help us in our decision making. So let's just pause for a moment and work our way through these questions, because they certainly build on some of what we spoke on earlier. And the first one saying, do we have an adequate crisis communications plan in place for all stakeholders? And Pete, a little bit of commentary from your standpoint about why that's so critical in this particular unique event.
Sure. I think where a lot of organizations are going to be focused is the immediate and what's facing them right now. And so that's, what do we do with our employees? What do we do about our customers? And what do we do about our business partners? And where directors need to weigh in is making sure that they're asking questions about the other stakeholders. If you're a Crown agency, do you have a political responsibility to inform the government of what the implications of this could be? And do you have a plan in place for informing the government of what the implications of this may be? So it's looking, as I said earlier, kind of a more of a horizon view to take into account different stakeholders that may not be front and center and may not have an immediate, they may not be immediately impacted by the decision the organization makes, but they will feel it at some point, and so do you have a plan to deal with them, right?
And I think the disclosure issues are tricky in this context. I know we've been talking with clients about the challenges involved in the current situation, in part because there are different stakeholder interests, and sometimes there's a propensity to say less, but there are from an investor standpoint, but from a other stakeholder standpoint, I think we're in a context where people see merit in saying more, and so then you have to balance how you deal with different stakeholder interests. I think from an overall market perspective, you have to also be conscious that we're in an unstable market environment. Often there are pressures on a company's IR department to be providing transparency to investors. As lawyers, we're very cautious about private disclosures because you have to worry about selective disclosures. And so, even though a company may not want to be proactive, recognizing that you don't want one-off freelance private conversations, there is merit in having a structured public communication that can be used not just with investors, but also with your other stakeholders, and making sure that all of those communications for different stakeholders are coherent so that they are telling the same story, I think is important.
Right. And when we look at question number one that's talking about adequate crisis communications plan, this won't be anything new to boards. They generally, let management put it together, but let them know what it is. But when we look at the second question where we say, are there, and these are in quotes, disclosure requirements that we need to consider, I think changes it a little bit and puts it into this unique crisis space. And you've alluded to a little bit of it, but there's legal disclosure, but then there's also perhaps legislative, there's also perhaps ethical disclosure, or just flat out prudent disclosure. So whether you're in a public company or a private corporation, or whether you're in a Crown, not-for-profit, or charity, it seems like this would be a time that the board really needs to be digging in to the crisis communications plan, perhaps differently than they would have before.
I think that's fair. I think it's probing and making sure look, the world is changing. We spent a lot of time earlier talking about the board needs an increased cadence of information, an increased cadence of meetings to help fortify the planning, to help ensure that the organization's on the right track. So do the stakeholders. The world is changing every day, so are your employees getting new messages? And just because an organization has communicated once to key stakeholders, that may not be enough in this context. And people are getting different pieces of information from elsewhere. Cornell mentioned earlier, you want that structured communication. You want it measured. You want to make sure people have signed off on it, and you want it to be consistent to different stakeholders. But again, the frequency definitely is going to have to increase.
And I think, Peter, I heard you earlier say, this is a situation where different stakeholders are searching for information. And so it's not the case that you can deal with a situation like this without communicating. So people are going to look and find the information, and so it's really up to you as to whether you want to be proactive and communicate it on an overall basis that is in the kind of best interest of the company. And I think, Rahul, to your point, if I'm a board, obviously the board can't be approving every single message that goes out to every single stakeholder, but I think you'd want to fully understand the strategy and approach and have a good sense of how different interests will be prioritized when it comes to providing information.
Right. Both of you are in businesses that provide professional services to boards and to companies of the sort. And this speaks to our third question. How and when should boards reach out to professionals such as yourselves? And we broadened it to legal, crisis communication, financial and government relationship advisors. So at what point do boards look at what they've got and say, you know what, we need to reach outside of our management team? Can you give a little bit of guidance on that?
Look, I think, number one, I think the board wants to be comfortable that the company and the management team has the resources it needs. And, when you're in a crisis, you want to make sure the resources are there. And sometimes it is, the board has to basically be direct with the management team that it's not a time to try and do everything yourself, and you ought to be availing yourself of additional resources because these are high-stakes moments. I think, Rahul, your question about when does the board need to itself get additional advice, I think every board has to ask itself whether it's comfortable that it can rely on what it's hearing from management, whether it's comfortable that it understands all of the questions and the issues, or whether it feels it needs to supplement what management is getting and get its own second view and put itself in a position where it can provide a constructively critical and enhance its ability to provide a constructively critical advice to the management team.
I think that's absolutely right. And what outside advisors can help as well is that almost cross-pollination of seeing what other organizations are doing in this very circumstance, never mind similar circumstances. Other organizations are facing this very similar circumstance. So outside advisors may have a bit more of a broader perspective from what other industries are doing or what Crown agencies are doing or nonprofits are doing. I think that can be quite valuable if you're in that space to be able to learn from the others. And
we've been getting an awful lot of calls on different issues, and I think, Peter, it's exactly that point where people want to reach out because they want to understand. There's if people are dealing with big issues in real time, and they want to avail themselves of the experience of other companies, but also there's some protection in making sure that you're not doing things that are way off the industry standards. So we get a fair number of questions that are really people seeking to find out where they stand relative to market practice.
Right. So let's have a look at the next three questions sort of as a bunch together, which is a little bit about business continuity and what do we know? So do we understand our economic exposure to COVID-19, including the downstream impact? What's our response plan if our workforce is exposed? And have we identified how our key partners and stakeholders may be impacted by this situation? So when you think about boards faced with this crisis and questions around business continuity, what advice would you be providing boards around this area? Because you're right, earlier you said that it's up to up to management to develop the forecasts and the scenarios. But now we're in a crisis management. You talked about prioritizing a little bit further. Do you want to comment a little bit more on the business continuity side?
Well, I think whatever plan existed 2 months ago, I think has to really be tested against the current situation and against the reasonably, foreseeable best and worst case scenarios, because the situation is dynamic and evolving, and it has to, most plans would not necessarily take account of the fact that the very management team itself might be incapacitated for a period of time. And so you have to really test against different scenarios, and as a board be comfortable that everything is being done to make sure the business can function in the best way possible through the different scenarios.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I guess what you could say is you're developing scenarios, good, bad, and worse. You can look at Italy. You can look at other countries and see what would happen if what's happening in Italy happened here. What would happen? How would we be able to manage that? So I think you can develop the plans that address something to an extreme point of shutting down a lot of countries' country operations, and what the impact is going to be for the organization, and looking at models like that. I think you also want to keep in mind at all times is that, again, the situation, there's no clear roadmap. There's no clear sense of what the implications will be, except that we do know it has the profile is it's going to get worse. So are we ready for it going to get worse? Rahul, you would ask, about what happens if one of the questions, if our employees get it. It's not just the employees, though. It's the employees may have it. Their family members that they have to look after may have it, and so they're incapacitated. They may not be able to get to work because transit systems are impacted. So there's a huge kind of repercussion and ripple effect as these issues manifest themselves, that, no, the board doesn't have to have the answer to all of these things, but the board should be asking management the question, do we have these scenarios mapped out? And, if you happen to plan for an extremely bad situation and it doesn't go that bad, very little loss. If it's the other way around, very great stakes involved.
And I think, to go back to another thing we talked about earlier, the prioritization point. At the end of the day, it's probably unlikely that most companies can have a perfect continuity plan in this context. It's not going to deal with every risk, but you're going to prioritize certain risks, certain customers, certain relationships, certain interests. And I think at the end of the day, boards will, after the fact, I think the board wants to be able to say, look, we were aligned with the choices that were made and aligned with how different risks and relationships were prioritized. And I think the way to do that is just to make sure that you understand up front how decisions are going to be approached, and that you're kept informed along the way so you can test as the situation unfolds that decisions are being made on a basis that is comfortable from a values and business impact standpoint, because all of these things, of course, have business impacts.
Right. So in a situation like COVID-19, it may not be the nicest thing to be discussing, but legal liability is often on the minds of directors and boards. Is there anything unique in this situation that would deviate from a general understanding of what a director's liability would be?
No, I think the board's responsibility in this context is the same as in every other context. It's a responsibility of oversight, and the board has to make sure that it's exercising due care, and the board will be protected from liability if it's acting on a fully informed and unconflicted basis. But the fully informed, I think, is the key point, and the board has to make sure that it is getting the information it needs to make good decisions. And I think that is, to me, the nub of it, making sure that it's fully informed about all of the issues and concerns, so that if something happens, it may be that the result is not anybody's first choice, but people were fully informed and made decisions on a intentional basis.
So we're talking a little bit about business continuity and then information, which really takes us to the last group of questions on 7 through 10, which really talk about what do we need to know. So, how do, boards, what steps can they take to make sure that they're actually getting timely, verifiable, and authoritative information?
Well, I think beyond getting information from management, which obviously we've talked about this quite a bit, about increasing that cadence, it's going to be necessary to have more frequent information from management. On something like this, again, it's affecting everybody, so there are multiple sources out there that you can turn to. many of which are quite authoritative. And so it's everything from the health organizations that are out there to what analysts, if you're a publicly traded company, the analysts are going to be writing reports on the implications and making sure that you're tracking what other experts and other third parties are saying about your, maybe not your organization, but certainly about your sector, about your industry, and using that information to balance what you're hearing from management and to add some much-needed context as this evolves.
So there are certain sectors that obviously have been in the news where they're experiencing more immediate business impact. If I were a director, I think one of the things I'd be very concerned about is to make sure that information is flowing up through the management channels, because it's a circumstance where things could be bad and, you know, there are short-term pressures. Again, people might not want to be totally upfront and believe that things are manageable or not manageable, but I think you want to make sure that within the management team there are systems and there's a culture where information is being brought up through the management channels without people self-editing based on what might look good or what might result in more questions being asked or not asked, and to make sure that there is free-flowing of information and that the right tone is being set. And then I think as a board, you want to make sure you've got an open dialogue with management so that you're fully understanding the impact of the situation and of the different decisions that can be made, so that you can react or not react as appropriate.
So do you think this would be a unique time for the board to pause and agree with management to get alignment on what sort of metrics around reporting are going to be appropriate through managing through this crisis? I mean, everybody's got their dashboards, their KPIs, but suddenly this is a bit of a game changer. Would it be appropriate for the board to have that conversation with management to say, we understand you've got your plans, your view on business continuity, but this is the type of information that we're going to need to help us in our decision making?
So I think it's absolutely right, proactively to establish what the information is the board's going to get. People have obviously dashboards and metrics that they're looking at in the normal course, but they're clearly being, you know, there are additional things people are thinking about in this context, and you'd want to make sure that on an organized basis, those information is being reported to the board using those metrics and parameters. And I think doing it upfront intentionally is the right thing to do. Obviously, it needs to be modified as things evolve, but I think agreeing upfront on what is to be reported and then how it's to be reported and figuring all of that on an organized basis, I think leads to better decision making. You don't want a circumstance where it's kind of left, in a sense, free form, and, you know, management tell us if there's an issue, because that's not putting the board in a position where it can react and deal with things on a responsible basis.
Peter? Keep the processes structured and have a clear framework of how to operate, but the information that is communicated in that is going to change the situation.
And I think within the board, you know, one of the things that I've become aware of over the years is within boards, sometimes some directors have a perception that other directors are more informed. And I think it's an important thing for the chair of the board to be sensitive to the fact that, you know, the chair might feel very informed and comfortable, but other directors aren't necessarily feeling that way. And you have to think about not just making sure that there's good flow to the chair, but that other directors have a way to make sure they're informed. You don't really want a system where individual directors are kind of figuring out how to get information themselves personally and individually. You really want to have systems in place, because I think it's make sure that people are getting good information, but also that you're using everybody's time effectively.
So let's build out a little bit on that, on the role of the chair. So you touched on that a little bit, and I'm sure people are wondering too, when is the time to have an ad hoc committee around a crisis like that? There are risk committees, sometimes risk is in audit and finance, sometimes small boards, you just don't have those number of committees. But let's say there's the role of the chair in leadership in making sure there's dissemination of information that's appropriate and the right conversations are taking place. And then there may be a moment that you cross the Rubicon into, we need a separate committee to help manage through these. Would you like to offer some comments around that?
Well, I think it's a question for at the end of the day, the board has to be satisfied that it's providing effective oversight. And whether it does that as a whole, or whether it in effect delegates that formally or informally to a group of directors who will basically be more engaged than the rest of the board is able to be, I think is an important question for every board to ask. I certainly, in circumstances like this, I think in practice it does turn out often to be the case that one or more of a subset of the board will play a bigger role, because it's hard to convene the whole board. It's hard for everybody to be involved in every decision. And so agreeing up front on who those people are and making sure they're the right people with the right perspectives, whether you want the chair of the audit committee or whether you want, who those people are going to be, and then how that group then interacts with the rest of the board, I think is an important second question.
Before I come to you to comment on this one, Peter, I just want to remind our participants, please do submit questions through the Q&A.
Yeah, I was just going to say, following Cornell's point, we've spoken a lot about the need to have more information, to have more frequency of meetings, to have more flow of information. It's pretty hard to do that with full board. And so having a subcommittee meeting regularly, having the subcommittee report back up to the board does make a lot of sense. If you want the agility and the speed with which a smaller group can meet and respond and act, you can't wait for the full board to convene every time.
So let's talk a little bit more about that then. What is the right cadence of reporting to the board during a crisis like this? If it's not business as usual for the board, and if we want to engage more individuals so they're all on the same page and aligned with management going forward, obviously the quarterly meetings aren't going to make any sense at all. The committee meetings, the typical structure aren't. Cornell, what are you seeing? Is the cadence changing in boards reporting through crises?
I think so. I mean, I think if certainly I talked to one company yesterday where they've instituted a system of having a subset of the board have a weekly call with the CEO to talk about the issues that the CEO is contending with, and in effect to satisfy themselves as to the kind of responsiveness of the company to the different challenges. And they've gone to that because of this situation. And I think that's myself a reasonable approach. And obviously when you have a call like that, it means you've got a moment that's scheduled, and in the context of a crisis, if you don't have that kind of thing set up, it can sometimes escape you.
And I would add to that it really is contextual based on the organization. For some organizations, this could be an existential threat. They may need to have daily meetings, and because the impact is going to be so severe, depending on what might happen in the situation, that I don't think you can even wait for weekly. I think it's going to have to be almost at least a daily check-in to see what situations happen. We see it with other crises. We see it with, even on M&As, there can be 2-3 times a week as you're going through a process. If it's a hostile M&A, that you have a subcommittee meeting on a regular basis like that. And so increasing that cadence, you can always scale it back or you can have shorter meetings, but you want to make sure that directors are providing the oversight. Cornell, you said that a few times, and it's an important point.
No, I agree with you, Peter. I think it's definitely the case that the management teams will be meeting all the time. And as a board, I think the question is, how often do you feel you need to engage with management to make sure you actually know what's going on? Because if the management team has met 6 times and made 6 decisions, and you don't hear about it till the end of the week, and these decisions are ones that the board might have had thoughts on, it's kind of too late. And so you have to make sure that you do have a cadence that reflects the intensity of the thinking and decision-making processes that are going on.
So it speaks to the relationship between the CEO and the board chair to make sure they're fully aligned, to make sure there's free flow of management. That's great. I do want to move to the Q&A now. We have some interesting questions that are actually both from very different areas here. And Peter, I'm going to come to you on the first one. Actually has to do with SARS and H1N1. And the question here is capturing, if I paraphrase a couple of them here, is we keep hearing that COVID is unprecedented. And their question is how is this different from SARS or H1N1? And maybe embedded in that is that there are some directors who've actually gone through a crisis, such as SARS or H1N1, and they're wondering what could be different about COVID.
I think, first of all, the scale of it is probably going to be quite a bit different. I don't recall what the exact numbers were on H1N1 or SARS, but we're now at 121,000 infected globally, and that number keeps exponentially growing. So I think that's point number one. I think to social media has also changed the landscape immensely from those other two, from the other two pandemics or threats of pandemics that we've had in the past. And so you're being judged in real time, and you're being judged by stakeholders, and people have a voice that didn't have a voice before. So I think it's quite different for organizations in terms of the external pressures they may be facing because of the nature of social media.
So not to get too far outside the boardroom, but news has come in that Laurentian University has just announced that they're moving all their classes online for the foreseeable future, much like some of the U.S. universities have done. But in this case, they did it because a person in Sudbury, as we knew through the Globe and Mail today, attended the PDAC conference in Toronto last week, and now they're going to be asking staff who was also at PDAC to self-quarantine. And the question here, once again, a little bit outside the boardroom, but equally relevant, how cautious is too cautious, Peter?
Well, again, what I was saying before, you're going to be the situation is affecting a lot of organizations, every organization, and you're going to be judged in hindsight. People are going to pass judgment based on decisions you made in real time, and that isn't necessarily fair, but that's what we're going to have to deal with. And so boards are going to have to be confident that the decisions they're making will stand the test of time, or that at least they can defend them when people start looking back and start questioning, why did you go ahead with that? Why did you make the decision to proceed? You've got some conferences going ahead, others being canceled. You've got some operations being scaled back, others not. So there is a real-world comparison that people will be able to make, comparing Organization 1 to Organization 2, Company 1 to Company 2, and you better be pretty comfortable that the decisions you're making can stand and align with the values of the organization.
And Rahul, I think that example highlights the trade-offs. You know, in Laurentian's case, they've already gotten tuition checks from the various students. And so sending people home and saying, do your courses online, you know, there's an impact on the quality of the educational experience, but financially, there's not a huge consequence for the university. By contrast, you know, shutting down a factory or shutting down some other operation in the business can have a real business impact. And I think most companies, the trade-offs are more challenging. Laurentian can be very conservative. I think in most companies, the trade-offs are more complicated because sending your workforce home and, you know, in circumstances where they can't all necessarily work productively from home has bigger business consequences. And I think, Peter, to your point, the board has to be comfortable that they're comfortable with those trade-offs, you know, people trade-offs versus business trade-offs, and comfortable both with the decisions today, but also how they'll look in hindsight.
So the next question I'm going to refer to pushes that envelope of thinking just a bit. And let's for a moment assume that the board of directors of Laurentian University was involved in this discussion somehow, and I think that's a fairly safe assumption. But the next question actually links it with directors' liability for environmental issues. And the underlying this question is that their belief is that there's been a harder pursuit of directors for environmental issues of organizations, which leads to the question of, does the COVID issue hold the same risk of a higher level of legal problems? In other words, does it raise the bar of liability anywhere by its nature towards the decision-making of a board? Is there something unique in COVID, somewhat analogous to this individual who believes it's analogous to, let's say, the higher bar for environmental liability?
Look, there are clearly potential legal exposures involved for every company, and to the extent there's a risk of harm to employees, and a company takes steps to knowingly to put employees in harm's way, and something bad does happen, then as a company you would be concerned about your risk of potential exposure. And so whether it's personal exposure for the directors, I think that's, those issues are maybe in one category, but I think we are dealing in situations where there are difficult potential exposures, whether it's legal exposure, reputational exposure, and I think as a board, you want to be very aware of the trade-offs that are being made to make sure that they're ones that you're comfortable with, taking account of all of the circumstances, which aren't there's no perfect answer here. These are judgment calls.
And again, to come back to the social media point, a lot of the factors that go into decisions that various organizations make could find their way into social media as well. And so it's not like you're making these in isolation and you're making them behind the closed doors in the boardroom. That's where you may make the decision. That may not be where they're judged. They may be judged later on Twitter, and it's not as forgiving an environment there, and so you're going to have to deal with answers. So, for example, if a conference or if an event is a large-scale event is about to be held in a city, and they go to the local medical officer of health and say, what do you advise? And if the advice is, it's high risk, and the organization proceeds, that advice from the medical officer of health could find its way into the public domain, and then you're answering for that. So you're making the business call, and it may be a legitimate business call, and the board may have considered a whole host of options and a whole host of effects if they went the other way, but only some of the information they get into public domain, and you're then kind of fighting with that limited information in the public market.
You know, I was talking yesterday with an organization that had planned a large event, and they have insurance if they cancel, but the insurance, at least in their telling of it, is only available if they cancel it because of an order from a governmental body. And so there is an example of a precarious, difficult situation where clearly the safest thing would be to cancel, but if they cancel without a government order, it's at the cost of the organization, and so they're monitoring the situation, thinking hard about that. You know, if I were a director of a company where that kind of thing were material, I'd be very interested to know what the thinking process is, because there's a financial risk, there's a reputational risk, and at the end of the day, you could well own the decision, and you'd want to make sure you fully understood it.
Right. And the law around force majeure is not as black and white as some people would like it to be.
We not to market, but we published a memo on that today, and it's a very complicated area of law.
Interesting. So we know that there are a lot of activities, concerts, sporting events, et cetera, that are being either canceled or playing to empty audiences, as it were. But building on that a little bit as it relates to boards and AGMs itself, do you expect companies in Canada are going to start moving more to virtual board meetings and potentially virtual AGMs? And if I'm not mistaken, Starbucks has already agreed to do so in the U.S.?
So there was a story in the paper today about Enbridge announcing that it was holding it's going to hold a shareholder meeting virtually this year. I know we have other clients who are looking at that as well. And I think at this particular moment, there are lots of companies who are planning to go in that direction, and also in some cases, companies where that's not possible for legal reasons, planning to hold meetings with a physical presence, but not a lot of people, and
Right.
in practice on a virtual basis. So I think that is a live issue for companies, given the season.
Yeah, no, I think it makes a whole lot of sense. You want to be seen to be doing the right thing as well as doing the right thing, and holding a big meeting and holding a big event right now may not be seen to be doing the right thing.
Great. Okay, well, listen, I want to thank you for your time today. And ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our time in today's presentation. I want to thank Cornell and Peter for both joining us today. And for all our participants, we hope that you found today's session to be helpful. As mentioned, you can download the slides from today's session immediately, and the full recording will be made available on the ICD's website within 24 hours. For those of you who submitted questions that we were unable to get to, we'll endeavor to provide answers as part of our follow-up to this webinar. On behalf of the ICD and our guest speakers, I thank you again for joining us today, and stay tuned for additional webinars on this topic as the situation evolves.